was like 7, 8, around that point anyway, my dad bought a summer house in Jersey to spend during the latter part of July. I spent the last 2 weeks of the month on holiday in this little shack on the coast of St. Brelade. It was a dinky little wooden house that had been sitting in place for God knows how many decades, if not centuries. It was one of those historic, read old, houses that had modern comforts like electricity and running water forcibly shoved in, which was damn obvious if you ever saw the way the wire stuck out of half the sockets, or the fact that the chance of the toilet getting clogged was a total crapshoot with every flush. Dad bought it primarily because of the scenery. The shack sat atop these huge cliffs looking out into the North Sea. The cliffs were so high, I remember only just barely being able to hear the waves smashing against the rock face down below, especially over the winds. I can remember distinctly my first time outside the house, with nothing but my face exposed to the air. It was like someone whipping my cheeks with little leather straps again and again. It took me until I was about 13 to realise the real reason my dad took us there was to get as far away from my mother as his finances permitted, and for as long as he could. Not much to do in Jersey, especially for a kid. Our sort of go-to for many years was the Oseen Tower and beach, but that got old pretty quickly. The tower's nothing special, and even in July the water was usually too cold to go swimming. Honestly, looking back on it, the only thing even remotely memorable about these trips were how creepy they were, particularly during my younger years there. I would just lie in bed listening to the wind outside pushing against the aged wooden walls, making this awful groaning that sounded most like an old man strapped to a rack. But what really spooked me were the lights outside. I didn't notice them the first 2 years, but during the third, I was up late, unable to go to sleep for whatever reason. I looked out the window, hoping to see something of the moon shining on the water underneath the cliffs. But as I looked over the steep rocky surfaces of the surrounding cliffs, I saw something else. There were a bunch of little lights dancing like little fireflies by the edge of the cliff, several miles down the road from us. It was so dark and so far away that I had no idea of the light's size, let alone just what exactly they were. They were there for about an hour or so, moving in random directions with no discernible pattern of purpose before flickering out. I mentioned them to Dad the next morning, and he seemed pretty interested at first. We stayed up together the next night to see if they'd show up again, but we were both sorely disappointed. I stayed up the next 4 nights after that on my own, but I never saw anything before finally falling asleep. When I finally went back home for the coming school year, I told some of my mates about it, but they seemed more or less disinterested. It's not so much that they didn't believe me, it's just that it didn't matter to them either way. The lights were just my own little curiosity, and it didn't really impact them in the slightest. By next year I had pretty much entirely forgotten about them, but with my own problems to worry about, like whether Penelope Eccleston noticed my existence, or whether or not Carlisle United would win the next match. Fun fact, only one of those things still concerns me. Try to guess which one. But 5 days into the trip to Jersey I saw them again, just as bright and just as lively as ever. I wasted no time this go-round jumping out of bed, rushing down the hall to wake Dad. I pulled him, still half asleep, into my bedroom to see the lights for himself. Though we did see them, they didn't appear to have as much of an impact on him as they did on me. He gave a drowsy smile and said with a yawn, "Oh yeah, how about that?" For whatever reason, the lights didn't interest him as much as they interested me. That's not entirely too surprising. My dad's always been something of a dull bloke. But he at least humoured me enough to drive down to the edge of the cliffs the next day to see if there were any signs of the light's origins. Which there weren't. At least none in so much as we could tell. My dad chalked it up to young hoodlums partying and paid it no more heed than that. But I was not so easily deterred. After a while, I just stopped caring about what anyone else thought about them. I just wanted to know what they were. It was even enough to get me to look into the St. Brelade library to see if there were any historical accounts or stories about them, but there were none that I could find. The closest thing that I found were old stories of will-o'-the-wisps, but I'd already heard of those, and I knew that this was something different. Will-o'-the-wisps are always seen in forests and bogs, not on cliffs looming over the sea, and they're supposed to appear to lost travellers, not to people already sitting comfortable at home. The pattern was the same every year. The lights only ever appeared for about an hour, for just one night during the last week of July, though not always on the same day. If they ever appeared on a quiet night, when the winds were calm and the sea was resting, I would try to listen hard to see if they made any noise. I couldn't tell you for certain since they were so far away, but I could have sworn I heard men's voices shouting furiously and the long, loud calls of some animal. The call sounded almost like the trumpeting of an elephant, only higher and with something that... Well, it's what I imagine an elephant would sound like if it was screaming in sheer terror. But when the lights went out, everything went silent again. I haven't been to Jersey since I left home years ago. It's not that I dreaded going back or outright hated it, it just sort of never came up. That's how life works, I guess. The only reason I'm even bothering to say anything about it now is that I read this article the other day in The Guardian. It was about a place in Jersey called Le Côte de St. Brelade, or the Caves of St. Brelade. I'm actually surprised we hadn't heard about this place while we were there on holiday. It sounds infinitely more interesting than anything else we did there. Apparently the caves are fossil sites from about 50,000 years ago. In a little corner of the cave are piles of bones, mostly from things like woolly mammoths and things like that, all stacked neatly, and scattered all throughout the caves are stone axes like those used by Neanderthals. From what I've read, it seems that the Neanderthals would drive the mammoths over the cliffs. Apparently back then there was no North Sea, just a flat open grassland. Scientists don't know how the Neanderthals would have been able to drive such huge animals over the cliffs, but I have a guess.